Gary Neville is a man of many talents. Whether it's playing the game, coaching, commentating, owning a club, running a business, or just unnecessarily inserting the phrase, "what would actually be" into a sentence for no apparent reason, G-Nev can just about do it all. Neville is actually a very popular pundit, and whilst both of them divide opinions, who doesn't, his insights and discussions alongside Jamie Carragher on Monday Night Football generate an audience and level of interest that few other people talking about the game could. More recently though, Red Nev has taken a bit of heat for his coverage of the upcoming World Cup in Qatar. Neville has made several trips to Qatar in recent years, presenting a documentary inventively titled Gary Neville in Qatar in 2019, and most recently a new film called Gary Neville's Countdown to Qatar, which was uploaded to his YouTube channel The Overlap, where he can more frequently be found interviewing famous faces from the world of football and from other sports. A couple of days before that video came out, Neville confirmed on Twitter that he would be going to Qatar for the World Cup, which isn't particularly surprising, but also that he would be working for beIN Sports at the tournament, which is a Qatari state-owned media organisation, whose chairman is actually the PSG president, Nasser Al-Khelaifi, which, does just change things a little bit. Neville claimed in the same tweet that he would still be highlighting issues in Qatar like he has been doing for years, and whenever people have questioned his decision to work for the Qatari state and to make an episode of The Overlap all about Qatar's preparations for the World Cup, he has responded with the same message. Watch it. So, I did. And there is a lot to unpack in there, but I'm going to try and squeeze all of it into this video. If you have watched the Overlap video in question, that's great. If you haven't, that is also great. It doesn't really make any difference. I'm just going to focus on the bits that I feel are relevant, but you are of course free to go and watch it after this, if you haven't already, so that you can judge freely for yourselves whether or not I've given Red Nev a fair trial. The film starts at the FIFA World Cup draw on April 1st of this year, which Neville describes as a glamour event, concluding that this has been a political story for the last 12 years, but now the football enters the fray, before heading off to the Lusail iconic stadium, which is the largest of Qatar's new World Cup stadia, and will host 10 World Cup games, including the World Cup final. Neville asked Tamin El Abed, the Lusail Stadium's project manager, how much the stadium cost to build. And when Al Abed tells him that the entire stadium, sporting complex, surrounding area and related infrastructure cost just $1 billion, Neville says, well, it's less expensive than Tottenham, seemingly surprised by that given the world-class facilities and hospitality suites. Yeah, well, that's probably because Tottenham actually paid the people who built their ground, Gary, £3.8 million a week in total at the height of its construction, to be specific, with the average worker on site paid £1,000 a week, and some electricians earning as much as £400 a day as contractors. That compares with a minimum wage of just $275 a month for migrant workers in Qatar, a minimum wage that was itself only introduced in 2021, by which stage construction of almost all of the stadiums, including the Lusail Stadium, had already been completed. Prior to that, some migrant workers reportedly went entirely unpaid, tied to extremely unfavourable yet binding contracts, and told by their employers that their accommodation and food expenses outweighed their salaries, meaning that they would receive no extra payment beyond the bare minimum of their expenses, or even that they were indebted now to their employers, hence their characterisation as indentured servants, or even in some cases slaves, given that their passports were taken from them by their employers, and they didn't even have the resources to buy a plane ticket home. Maybe some of that would have been worth pointing out in the film, but we will just skate over that for now, much like Gary did, and move on to what Neville described as a chance meeting with two delegates from the Football Association who were in Qatar at the same time as him. The conversation is ostensibly about alcohol consumption and legal restrictions within Qatar, and Tony Coniford, who is an ex-cop of 36 years, who has been the Football Association's head of teams and corporate security since 2014, tells Neville that he has made 4 trips to Qatar now, that he has witnessed people drinking and having a good time, and describes it as, quote, a bit of a myth that you can't do this stuff. Coniford says that every World Cup presents different issues, which is superficially true but disingenuous. Every Olympics presents different issues, but the one in 1936 was particularly egregious and problematic for a very specific set of reasons, before stating that there are concerns about different cultures, which is a very dubious framing, the inference there being that it is somehow bigoted to take issue with human rights abuses or certain laws and societal attitudes within Qatar, which is obviously absolute nonsense, not least because there are people within that culture who also oppose extreme religious conservatism and Salafism, and they are met with repression, arrest, and sometimes worse in Qatar. The Qatari people do not represent a monoculture, and neither does Islam, of course. The idea that there is just some homogenous Muslim or Islamic world which has one unifying set of beliefs is palpably absurd, and the caricature of people who live typically in Western Asian kingdoms, most of which were previously ruled or dominated over by the British Empire, who shaped the region in many respects by propping up these dictatorial royal families who still preside over vast amounts of territory and millions of people because they would protect the economic interests of British and American businesses and the British and American states, hence why they are still considered to be our allies in the region, is deeply insulting and bigoted, particularly to the brave people who do choose to dissent in countries where doing so is so often met with force. The last thing that Coniford says, in his eternal wisdom, is that everything that I've seen on the visits that I've been, the Qataris just want to make everybody as welcome as they can. They're very open in saying that this is our house, we do have some rules that we live by, but you are welcome. Alright, let's just unpick that one, shall we, because there is an awful lot in there. So, apparently, the Qatari state has spent $160 billion hosting a football tournament because they just want to make everybody as welcome as they can. That is literally all they want, according to Tony. Can you believe that? How selfless of them. I sure do feel silly now for ever having doubted their intentions. What a remarkably benevolent gesture. To be clear, this isn't just a stupid thing to say about Qatar hosting the World Cup, it would be a stupid thing to say about any country hosting any major sporting event. No country spends tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars hosting the World Cup or the Olympics just to make people feel welcome. It is a very nice world that Tony, the ex-cop, lives in, and I wish that I lived there too. But I'm afraid that it isn't the one that is commonly referred to as Earth. So firstly, yes, Tony, I'm sure that they are very welcoming, especially to FA delegates. This is a propaganda exercise after all. It wouldn't make all that much sense or have been worth all of the hassle to stage a World Cup and then just tell everyone to sod off when they arrive. Secondly, they are very open in saying, this is our house, we do have some rules that we live by, but you're welcome. Ah, well, that's alright then. As long as you're alright with the house rules, come on in. You know, I have heard the same thing said about the United States during the 1830s. There were some house rules, you know, if you're black, you're a slave, sorry about that, and if you're a Native American, well then, you are fair game for a bit of ethnic cleansing and murderous displacement, but so long as you chill with all of that, welcome aboard. Obviously you're super welcome. Uganda was actually really hospitable under the dictatorship of Idi Amin, so long as you weren't an Asian Ugandan or a political dissident. Good, decent, hard-working, army-loving Ugandans really couldn't have been any more welcome. It's probably worth reminding ourselves at this point of some of Qatar's so-called house rules. They include blasphemy is punishable by up to 7 years in prison, apostasy is punishable by death, homosexuality is illegal, and punishable by up to 5 years in prison, or technically the death penalty for Muslims. Women are required to have male guardians, and their testimony is worth only half of a man's in some courts. Any intimacy in public can lead to arrest, and sex outside of marriage, regardless of the sexes involved, is punishable by up to 7 years in prison, though such sentences are usually only meted out to poor migrant workers and women from Southeast Asian countries, who often initially report that they have been raped, only for a judge not to believe them and to hand them a prison sentence instead. Alrighty then, so long as you're alright with all of that, and I really don't think that we're asking for too much here, you're absolutely ruddy bloody welcome in Qatar. Come and enjoy the footy. Oh, and also, did I mention how friendly they were to me, King of the Cops and an FA delegate? They didn't do any human rights abuses on me. I didn't even witness any actually from the balcony of my 5-star, $2,000 a night hotel room, so I would be pretty surprised if there are any going on. Sweet Jesus. And we're only 8 minutes in. Don't worry, about 35 minutes of it is just Gary wandering around lavish hotels, cruise ships, and hospitality suites going, "Wow, amazing, this is incredible, and they said that it couldn't be done." Out of interest, who actually said that? At least as far as I can tell, the objection to Qatar hosting the World Cup has always been on the grounds that their winning bid to host the tournament was ludicrously corrupt, the country has committed a raft of human rights abuses, and the conditions and outcomes for migrant workers building the stadiums and related infrastructure projects have been appalling. Not that, with a limited budget and practically free labour, that they wouldn't be able to knock up some pretty buildings and fancy dining rooms with which to woo dignitaries, wealthy supporters, and useful idiots. It should be said, of course, that much of what I have just either mocked or critiqued were the words of Tony Coniford at the FA and not those of Gary Neville, so I don't think that he is remotely responsible for them. But Neville, and everyone who is responsible with the editorial side of things at the Overlap, did take the decision to platform Coniford, uncritically. Neville did not challenge or even question a single word that he said, and no dissenting or opposing views were presented, and for that, Neville is very much responsible. In a relatively recent episode of The Overlap, which I suspect was filmed at the same time as the documentary that was just released, Neville also interviewed his old teammate, fellow Salford City shareholder, and friend David Beckham. Not only did Neville refuse to scrutinise Beckham over his decision to become an ambassador for the 2022 World Cup, becoming a mouthpiece and advertising tool for the Qatari regime, both within and outside of football, in a deal that was reported to be worth £150 million, but like every British and, as far as I'm aware, global media figure who has interviewed Beckham up to this point, Neville didn't even acknowledge that such a deal existed. He didn't even mention it. No one does. Of course, it is possible that Beckham has it written into his contract with broadcasters that he will only talk to them if they don't bring it up. That wouldn't remotely surprise me. But Neville claims in the video that he had been told by the Qatari regime that nothing would be off limits. Yet, he didn't ask Beckham about the reported £150 million that he had received, nor did he question Tim Cahill, who was interviewed in the Overlap film, about his role as Chief Sports Officer at the Aspire Academy in Doha, and his repeated apology for the regime that has tainted a lot of Aussies' affection for the Socceroos legend. Neville is either lying, therefore, about nothing being off limits, he is just not very good at his job and capable of asking even the most basic questions that are clearly in the public's interest, or he is a coward who would rather keep friends and public figures on side than ask any awkward questions. That might seem like quite strong language, but I'm not really sure how I can put a more generous slant on it than that. But hey, there is still lots of the episode left, maybe things will improve. Later in the film, Neville interviews Sawed Al-Hashimi, a player for the Qatar women's team, who says that women have either always or have for a long time been able to attend football matches in Qatar, and that the future for the women's game there is bright. Good news. There is no mention by Neville or anyone else of the fact that women's football was only officially recognised in Qatar in 2009, or that the Qatar's women's team was only founded, upon FIFA's request, to make Qatar's ultimately successful World Cup bid appear to be more tolerable to the outside world, hence why the women's team's first game, which was a 17-0 defeat to Bahrain, was only played in 2010. Qatar's women's team then didn't play a single game in 2011, and after appearing at the WAFF Women's Championship in 2014, they then went 7.5 years without playing a single game, with their first and only game since April 2014 coming in November 2021, when they played an unofficial friendly game against the exiled Afghan women's team after the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan and banned women's sport. It seems as though the Qatar women's team play roughly the same number of games as Afghanistan's women's team will under the Taliban, which is none. Does this seem like a nation that is taking women's football seriously to you? They haven't even bothered to keep up the pretense of caring for the last 8 years in the build-up to hosting the World Cup. And do you not think, in the name of balance, informing the viewer, and just very basic honesty, that might have been worth mentioning when it is claimed in an interview that women's football has a really big future in Qatar and that it is, quote, developing slowly, but it is developing. Blimey, 1 game in 8.5 years, that sure is some slow development. There is slow, Martin D. Michaelis slow, and then there is just very evident PR exercises which aren't really happening at all, and when it comes to the development of women's football in Qatar, it makes Martin D. Michaelis look like Kylian Mbappe. And in response to my earlier question that surely some of that might have been worth mentioning, Gary Neville sadly disagrees. His response was, instead to wait for Hashimi to finish, smile, and then just say, yeah. I actually found a video of Hashimi from 2018, which was uploaded to YouTube by DW, where she said that sometimes if she played football with boys as a child, her father would beat her. And in 2019, she is quoted as having told Human Rights Watch that there aren't many girls who play football, so she plays with boys instead. In the DW video, Hashimi also states that football is seen as being for boys in Qatar, and that idea hasn't changed much. Presumably, if she has been put forward by Qatari authorities as the woman for Neville to speak to, they were confident that she would remain on message. And I don't really want to see Gary Neville skewering a woman who previously said that her father beat her for playing football, but at least some context, as a narrator, would leave viewers somewhat better informed. To find out what life is like for Western women in Qatar, ahead of the World Cup, Neville interviews Farah Esmail, a presenter from Al Jazeera, the largest Qatari state-owned media outlet. Al Jazeera English, who Esmail is employed by, do genuinely make some interesting documentaries and produce some insightful coverage on foreign affairs. But naturally, given that the Qatari state literally owns them, they are not all that inclined to criticise the state of Qatar, nor is someone who is employed by the state of Qatar likely to be as well. It would be like seeking out an impartial view on Putin and Russia's invasion of Ukraine from a presenter at RT, or, dare I say it, an accurate reflection of the totality of the public opinion in the United Kingdom towards things like a Jubilee and the Queen's death from a presenter at the BBC. Esmail tells Neville that no one is going to stop you from doing anything in Qatar. Now, I have no doubt that there will be great efforts made to avoid any negative stories throughout the duration of the World Cup, and the police in Qatar have already been told to turn a blind eye to foreigners doing things that they would ordinarily clamp down on. But it will still be interesting to see that theory put to the test. Esmail again repeats the mantra of respecting other people's cultures, so again, just as a reminder, in case it is needed, and since you are going to be hearing that a lot over the next couple of months, there are certainly cultural differences that we should all respect. When visiting a mosque, it is just basic manners and respectful to take off your shoes, and doing so hurts no one. Tipping service staff is not customary in Japan, and doing so can actually be considered insulting. So, probably don't do that. And in some US states, people get really upset if you set their flag on fire. So, I always avoid doing that when possible. On the other hand, you don't need to respect women being treated as second-class citizens, torture, or homosexuality being criminalised. In fact, it is deeply disrespectful, to women, the people who are being tortured and homosexuals, to respect those supposed cultural differences under any circumstances, including to the people in the country in question, in this case Qatar, and there is absolutely nothing Western about calling those things out as being shameful and abhorrent. We hear a lot, including in Neville's documentary, about radical reforms, modernisation, and how hosting the World Cup has prompted Qatar to change. Yet, there are reputable human rights organisations who actually monitor meaningful change that countries implement, rather than meaningless platitudes and paying lip service, and they are less convinced. The Freedom in the World Index still ranks Qatar as one of the least free countries on earth, for very obvious reasons, with fewer political rights than even the citizens of Rwanda and Ethiopia. Amnesty International state that despite government reforms, migrant workers continue to face labour abuses and struggle to change jobs freely, women and LGBTI people continue to face discrimination in law and in practice, and that curtailment of freedom of expression has actually got worse, rather than seeing any positive reform, in the build-up to Qatar hosting the World Cup. Now, I'm not saying that nothing has improved. There do seem to have been some marginal improvements in worker conditions, rights and pay, though that is from the lowest possible baseline, but be extremely wary when anyone starts talking about reforms and the positive impact that the World Cup has had, since it is nothing other than a smokescreen for what is an irredeemably corrupt World Cup, which has been built on the backs of exploited migrant workers, who have often been reduced to the status of little more than indentured servants or slaves. Later in the film, Gary goes on a government-approved visit to some accommodation for construction and migrant workers, so it is probably safe to assume that these are among the most palatable surroundings that workers are housed in, yet they are still distinctively grim, and Neville makes no secret of the fact that they are barely livable. Gary attempts to interview workers in the presence of translators and government supervisors, so, unsurprisingly, they don't say that it is absolute hell, which, admittedly, Neville does say in this instance is frustrating, not being able to have unfiltered and uncensored conversations with them, yet he neither demands to be able to or says anything else about it. Hassan al-Thawadi, who is the Secretary General of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy for the World Cup, I bet he struggles to fit that into his LinkedIn, claims that the Guardian article that reported on the having been 6,500 deaths of migrant workers since Qatar was awarded with the World Cup is inaccurate. To nip this one in the bud, the article isn't inaccurate, as al-Thawadi claims, but some people's understanding of what that figure refers to is. It is not the case, as the film goes on to point out, and as some people seem to believe, that 6,500 people have died literally whilst working on construction sites building the stadiums for the World Cup. Qatari authorities claim that that figure is just 3, but it is the case that many migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka died in Qatar during a period of 10 years. Qatari death certificates put almost all of these deaths down to heart attacks or just sudden death, but fit, healthy working-age men don't just drop dead like flies in those kinds of numbers. The fact that they were exhausted, overworked, in unbearable heat, malnourished, living in unsafe conditions and practical squalor is almost certainly the reason why so many migrant workers have died. I would recommend my own documentary about Qatar, of course I would, which features a lot less delegates and Qatari officials than Neville's, but far more scrutiny. For more on that one, I will leave a link to it at the end. When confronted with the salaries and conditions of migrant workers, it should be said, even the state-approved conditions that he was allowed to visit, and the only recently implemented minimum wage, Gary does do a half-decent job of questioning a hotel general manager and government appointee, and he makes it clear that he disapproves of the gross levels of inequality in Qatar. But once he has them squirming, he gets a little bit awkward and changes the subject, rather than really nailing them by forcing an answer or letting their silence speak volumes. Towards the end, Neville reiterates the fact that Qatar is a Middle Eastern Muslim country, which A lot of people like to point out as though anyone's issue with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab Emirates is their geography or religion. Alright, I'm sure that is some people's issue with them, but no reasonable or right-minded person. Qatar is a brutal, authoritarian dictatorship. That is the issue, not that it is 76% Muslim or a bit hot and sandy. Gary's final monologue begins with the statement, "No country is perfect." Another tired cliche that you will hear trotted out a lot around this World Cup, which is superficially true, but essentially meaningless. No aeroplane pilot is perfect, but I would much rather have one with bad breath than one who deliberately flies the plane into the side of a mountain. No doctor is perfect, but Harold Shipman was definitely worse than most. No late-night television presenter is perfect, but I would still rather jab scissors into my own eyes than have to watch James Corden. You get the general idea. I went into the overlap film with a very open mind, given Neville's claims that people should really watch it before passing judgment, and of course, there needs to be critical journalists who visit Qatar. After all, it was The Guardian's in-person investigation of migrant worker conditions that probably did more to highlight human and worker rights abuses in Qatar than any other media investigation, in the English-speaking world at least. And the alternative is that only uncritical and sycophantic journalists go to Qatar and report on the tournament, resulting in even more subservient media coverage. If anything, I was actually hoping that it would be really good, given that Neville is currently getting both barrels from some of the worst people in the world on social media. And I hardly want to be agreeing with a pound shop Katie Hopkins or a news channel that routinely gets fewer views than I got for a documentary about the history of the offside law. But nor was I blindly going to say that it was all great just because some headbangers were bashing him. In reality, I do think that it is a pretty shoddy piece of journalism, and I don't think that Neville needs to be on the payroll of the Qatari state, taking a job at beIN Sports just to cover the World Cup. What he has done, I should say, is nowhere near as egregious as Beckham, but that is much like saying that someone isn't as inappropriate around children as Prince Andrew. Allegedly. That is it for today's video. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so. Cheers.